Hi, welcome everybody to our Vermont Coverts lunchtime Zoom with Joe Roman about his new book, Eat, Poop, and Die. I think that sounds really interesting. What a title for a lunchtime talk, huh? Um, let me tell you a little bit about Joe. Joe is a conservation biologist, marine ecologist, writer, editor-in-chief of earthinvaders.org, and fellow and writer in residence at UVM's Guns Institute for Environment. He's winner of the 2012 Rachel Carson Environmental Book Award for listed dispatches from America's Endangered Species Act. And we actually had a great discussion with him on that book earlier this past winter, which is why I was really excited to have him talk for us today. He's written for the New York Times, Science, Audubon, New Scientist, and other publications. And he considers himself a free-range biologist. I like that title, Joe. So I'm going to turn it over to him. He'll share his screen. We'll hear about Eat, Poop, and Die, and then we'll have some time for questions. If you have questions during the talk or after, just type them in the chat box and I'll relay them to Joe. Joe, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. And I'm glad we managed to fix the little glitch there. The website that I run, by the way, speaking of eating, is actually Eat the Invaders, not Earth Invaders. And I think the title gives it away. We've been talking about invasivorism and eating non-native species for a while. I'm looking out the window and looking at the garlic mustard and the Japanese knotweed that's out here. A topic for another conversation, perhaps, but you can see a theme running through my work. So thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Laura, for inviting me. And I'm going to see if I can share my screen and give me a thumbs up if this works. Share. And let's see. I'm going to try and get this there. Lisa, before you leave, is that showing the whole screen, or I think it's not quite showing the whole screen, is it?
It's not yet in presentation mode.
Okay. How's that?
Now it's in presentation mode.
Excellent. Okay,
Very
great.
cool picture.
Thank you. This really, will be a little foreshadowing for how much the world has changed since I was a kid. And, we all know about a lot of things that have gone in the wrong direction, but whales are ones that have actually, especially humpback whales, when people started studying them seriously about 50, 100 years ago, no one ever saw these huge amounts, these superpods, because they had been hunted out. Here's a foreshadowing that we can turn that around, both in the oceans as well as in places like Vermont. So let's see. I'm trying to change my slides. There's a slight delay here. I'm not sure what's up. Oh, there we go. So things are a little glitchy today, pardon me to the folks there. So start this story, November 14th, 1963. There was a volcanic eruption off the southeast coast of Iceland. There were really just a small fishing boat was the first to see it. The cook got up early in the morning. He smelt some sulfur, woke the engineer. The engineer didn't see anything wrong with the engine. And then they went out and they were caught in a whirlpool. And then within the day, this enormous eruption column reached up to 400 feet into the sky and eventually a mile or two into the sky. It had come from a fault about 500 feet beneath the surface of the ocean. This eruption column had ash and cinders, rock fragments, and the explosion, the smoke from the explosion could be seen from throughout Iceland. So, sorry about the delay on these on the slides. Ah, there we go. So this is what it looked like a few weeks after it erupted. You can see that the eruption column there, and at that point, it was growing at about 25 cubic yards per day. That's per second, sorry, or that's about the size of a Great Pyramid of Giza every day was the growth of this. It's in Southeast Iceland. It's in this along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And people now are starting to come in and they're interested. They're not landing yet, it's too active, but they're interested in seeing what this new island might look like. Some people are ready with thinking once this cools off, it would be a cool place for tourism. But fortunately, Icelandic biologists and geologists insisted that they keep the place pristine. So this is what Surtsey Island looks like in 2021 when I had the good fortune to visit it. It is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's one of the youngest islands in the world. It just turned 60 last year, celebrated its 60th birthday. And it's very restricted who can visit this. So only about 6 to 8 biologists and 6 to 8 geologists can visit for 2 weeks per year. And I was fortunate enough to be one of them in 2021. It was really foggy the day we were supposed to go out by helicopter. It was canceled, and the next day, this was a Coast Guard trying to get us out there, canceled it again. I was starting to think we only have a 2-week window. I'm never going to get to Surtsey. Fortunately, that afternoon, the Coast Guard saw a brief window in the fog, and they got us here. So it's a World Heritage Site now, not because there are plenty of rocks in the ocean, but because Icelanders have made it a living laboratory. No one's allowed to visit, so they could see how life could grow on an island where there was no life at all. In fact, at this time, when it emerged in the 1960s and when biologists were getting there in the 70s, it was funded by the US Atomic Energy Commission, some of this research, because they wanted to know what life would be like after an enormous blast, a blast like they saw at Surtsey. These are the first 2 known birds to have nested, to have been born on Surtsey in the early 1970s. I spoke to Erling Olafsson, who at that time was a young biologist working on the island. He took this picture, and what's fun about going out on the island now with a lot of those researchers is many of them are older than the island themselves. So you're walking on land that's actually younger than a lot of the biologists, as well as some of the birds who can live more than 50 years, 60 years. So even some of the birds there may have been around before Surtsey emerged. Now, what does this have to do with the ecology of the island? No one knew at that point, but the birds are going to give us a clue as to how life can start on a barren island. This is what Surtsey looks like for much of it now and what it probably looked like in the 1970s. A few species like maritime species like oysterleaf that can survive. How do they survive in such a barren landscape? They float on the ocean with enormous seeds, and those seeds have lots of nutrients. A new island like this has very limited amount of nitrogen, so most plants can't survive. So it's only the plants that can float in and pack their own luggage, their own food that survive there. So for the first 2 decades, it really kind of looked like a moonscape with only a few species arriving. A few insects might blow in from the mainland. You can see in the background there, the Vestman Islands. Those are also part of this volcanic archipelago, though they are a lot older, hundreds of years, a lot older than Surtsey. So I had mentioned those seabirds that came in. Over time, what started out as 1 pair ended up being hundreds of pairs of seabirds and eventually several hundred different species, everything from lesser blackback gulls to herring gulls to kittiwakes, all coming into this area to nest. Why was it attractive? Well, one, it's in the middle of the ocean, and these are seabirds, so they're surrounded by food, krill or fish, but also there are no predators on the island. No people, no agriculture, no foxes that are found on the mainland. So it was a great place for birds to start nesting. What do they do while they're nesting? Well, in addition to sitting on their nest, they're also depositing poop. Each seabird releases about 3 ounces of poop per day. And on Surtsey, birds now deposit about 60 pounds of nitrogen per year onto the island. That's roughly equivalent of what a farmer might put on pasture land, on permanent pasture land. So a significant amount of nitrogen. So again, this is what Surtsey looked like before the birds, or where there are no birds. And this is what it looks like now, where the birds are feeding. This is the seabird breeding colony. There are 50 times more biomass in this area. And there are now more than 50 different species of plants, because once they have the nutrients, then even plants that float, seeds that floated in on the wind, as many do, could survive because that nitrogen was there. So now we're starting to see a feedback loop. The birds are now having a larger area, a safer area to nest in, but they're also providing the nutrients for these plants. And you see in the background of that area, it's palagonite on the top, or that black lava. When you walk on there, as I did, you're always worrying about falling. It's really sharp. There are holes in that area. Then you get to this breeding area and you almost feel like you're a spongy trampoline. It can be about knee high, the grasses in that area, all thanks to the seabirds. And we now know this thanks to the work that these biologists have been doing over time, going there every year and tracing the changes. When they first got there, plants were so rare that they marked each one. And as one biologist said, it was like, it was similar to being at a cocktail party with your friends. They knew every single plant at that point. And nowadays, of course, that has changed, and it's there's much more abundant species, and it's very dynamic. And as more plants came in, more insects came in, and now you even have insect-eating birds coming in, and there's this dynamic ecosystem all built basically from seabird poop. And that's why I thought Surtsey really is probably the perfect place to start thinking about how animals can influence ecosystems, because we've been following it from scratch, and you can see the differences from space. Here's a timeline of the birds and the species that were found on Surtsey. Again, it emerged in 1963. The two species that started out there are the sea rocket and sea sandwort. They're adapted to traveling by ocean. They have lots of nutrients, so they did fine. The fulmars, the kittiwakes, and then the gulls are really what changed it, because they came in the hundreds and they really allowed the nutrients for annual meadowgrass. A species that we know as Kentucky bluegrass is there. It's actually native to Europe. So this really changed that system. And now we have buntings, we have geese and other species all thriving in this area. Even common puffins are starting to nest there. And when I was there talking to one of the biologists, he said, in the future, Surtsey will probably be the land of the puffin. As it starts to erode away, puffins love that kind of sharp cliff areas. So in the future, we'll probably see a lot more puffins and fewer of the gulls. It's not only gulls that are bringing nutrients, it's also gray seals, which you can see here. This is the northern spit of the island, and you can see that patch of green there. That's where the seals, they feed at sea, they pup in the summertime. So they're releasing nutrients through their feces, through their urine, but also through their placentas. So they're not quite as bringing as much nitrogen as the seabirds, but you can see that they're also helping catalyze, helping to start these new ecosystems throughout the island. And as I mentioned, you can see this from space. That's Surtsey on the right. For those of you who know what an ocean sunfish looks like, that's what it kind of reminds me of, a mola mola. But at the bottom of the slide there, that's the breeding area. You can see the green there. That's where the birds are. And up at the top of the slide, that's where the seals are. And they've been following plant cover over time. And you can see that from that graph on the left, the plant cover's much higher where the gulls and the seals are. When there's no animals, that's green at the bottom. You really don't have much life at all. these seabirds that are coming in here are not only affecting the island, but also the atmosphere around the island. And this is some cool work that was done about 10 years ago when a biologist was traveling in the Arctic and noticed that there were high amounts of ammonium off some of the islands, as well as high cloud cover. And what they realized was that the guano, the bird poop and pee, it releases ammonia into the atmosphere. That reacts with the sulfuric acid in the atmosphere, and that increases the size and number of cloud seed droplets, and that can increase rain and deflect sunlight and heat in these areas. So birds are not only affecting these islands, but also the atmosphere surrounding the islands, as well as, because they're pooping along the way, as well as the life around those islands. So they really are the catalyst for these changes. I want to show you a slide here. I've been talking about these close movements, basically birds moving maybe 10, 20, 30 miles back and forth to feed. But of course, as we know, animals travel across the planet all the time. And I'll read a little bit from my book to give you a background on how I started thinking about the role of animals here. And hopefully you'll get to see a movie of how this works. Yeah, so these are animals that have been tagged, and there's one group out of Germany that's following the movement of animals. Those are the light pink ones. And you can see this is summertime right now. They're moving north. And then as winter approaches, you're going to see them start moving south again. This is how I started to get an idea. One of my colleagues mentioned this, that animals might be like the circulatory system of the planet as they move around the world. It wasn't that long ago that animals were dismissed by many scientists as bit players on the planet. Plants and microbes took center stage, but in the past decade or so, there's been a radical shift in our understanding of how the world is shaped by predators and herbivores. Landmark studies of seabirds, whales, sea otters, salmon, cicadas, and other animals have shown that they can alter the landscapes and seascapes which these animals can provide. Much of this remains unseen. Few people realize that when they recline on the white sands of Hawaii and other tropical beaches, they are lying in the waste of parrotfish, the poop from coral meals. Animals matter. Creatures, sometimes with fur or scales, sometimes red in tooth and claw, perhaps with talons and wings, wild and free roaming, are a fundamental mechanism of sustaining life and a source for the nutrients it requires. It's only after thousands of years of serial depletion by our species that scientists are beginning to understand the interconnectedness of these energy transfers. Follow the nutrients. The essential elements of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus move in geologic time, carried by gravity, wind, and currents, downhill, downwind, downstream. If they reach the deep sea, phosphate and ammonia molecules could be locked away in the ocean depths for hundreds of years, unless they hit an area of upwelling, where waters are drawn to the surface. Such areas are rare in the ocean. But there is another way for these vital nutrients to move thousands of feet up the water column. They can catch a ride in the belly of a whale. Foraging sperm whales feed on giant squid and other deep-sea creatures, but they must return to the surface at least once an hour for a postprandial breath of air. There they rest, digest, and often release enormous fecal plumes rich in phosphates, nitrogen, and iron. The nutrients in the plumes can be picked up by the phytoplankton and consumed by zooplankton such as krill or tiny copepods. The krill or other fish predators might then be consumed by seabirds, gulls, fulmars, terns, penguins, petrels, and airlifted to their breeding grounds. Back at their nests, the birds feed their young by vomiting up their sea meals and excrete nitrogen-rich uric acid, the striking white paste that's released along with feces onto the land. We can follow these elements from the deep sea to the coasts, rivers, forests, savannas, and mountains of the world. A geological journey that would take thousands or millions of years. The tectonic plates beneath Iceland move at a rate of approximately 1.5 inches per year, about the speed of growing fingernails, can be reversed in a single dive. a short flight back to a barren rock, and a pollock-like spatter. Animals are the beating heart of the planet. In the same way the trees work as the Earth's lungs, inhaling carbon dioxide and exhaling oxygen, animals pump nitrogen and phosphorus from the deep sea gorges up to mountain peaks and across hemispheres from the poles to the tropics. Trillions of animals live the traveling life. They fly, run, swim, walk, even dig. Large and medium-sized animals, whales, elephants, bison, salmon, and seabirds, can move nutrients hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles. These long-distance travelers are the world's arteries. Cicadas, midges, krill, and other invertebrates, if we take this idea a step further, are the capillaries, delivering nutrients to Earth's tissues. So here is that showing you the movement of animals across the planet. But animals, the largest migration on the planet actually occurs every day. And rather moving horizontally across the planet, they move vertically. And this is the biological pump. There are trillions of zooplankton, think of krill, and also fishes that move up and down in the water column every day. They come to the surface to feed, and in the nighttime, and then during the day, they go towards the deep ocean to hide from other predators. In the process, they're moving back and forth. Some of their feces, some of their carcasses are falling to the bottom of the ocean, as well as some of the dead phytoplankton or algae. This is known as the biological pump. Incredibly important for our planet, both to provide organic matter to the deep sea, but also for climate, because a lot of the CO2 that we produce, that's produced across the world, is sequestered by the oceans. I learned about this process when I was in graduate school at the University of Florida. And I had been working as a whale biologist already for a number of years. And I noticed in this schematics that something was missing. Not all animals are moving in that direction. We have a house in Moncton, and about 10 years ago, we were insulating our basement, and I came across my notebook from the marine ecology class I took when I learned about the biological pump. I had been working on right whales the summer before in the Bay of Fundy, and this is the image I drew, and you can see in the middle there, right whales. They dive deep to feed like many whales do. They come to the surface. You often see enormous fecal plumes. And then I've posited that could be picked up by phytoplankton or algae. That would be eaten by the copepods, which in turn would be eaten by the right whales. Any of you who have heard about right whales in the news know that they're very rare right now. In the North Atlantic, there are only about 350. So at that point, I also thought, well, what about when there were 10,000 whales? And I was a graduate student at the time. We were talking during lunch, and you might be able to see on the right, I had to remind myself to eat at that point. I said 12:20 eat. So everything seemed to be scheduled at that point. It wasn't at the top of my mind. I was working on something else for my master's degree, but I was fortunate enough a couple of years later to meet Jim McCarthy, who worked on the IPCC and was a biological oceanographer at Harvard. He was one of the few biological oceanographers that was willing to entertain this idea. We eventually came up with the term whale pump for this idea. The biological pump removes nitrogen, carbon. The whale pump can release that and fertilize the surface of the ocean. As one of my colleagues said at the time, yeah, sure, Joe, there may be a couple of whale poops in the ocean, but does it make, is it ecologically important, or is it a fart in a hurricane? And that's what Jim and I set out to do, is to look at is this important? How important might it be in the oceans? What we found, we were working at the Gulf of Maine at the time, Bay of Fundy is on the upper right there. You all know that this area, that you can see Cape Cod on the lower left. And what we did when we calculated the amount of nitrogen whales were bringing to the surface is it was more than all rivers combined into that area. Not as high as atmospheric deposition. That's because a lot of nitrogen gets into the atmosphere due to human activities. Also not as high as coastal point sources, which is human poop that's going into the system. The whales, however, are delivering this nitrogen not right to the near the coastline, but to areas where they're feeding, and that can create this feedback loop. So we showed that indeed it could be ecologically important. We tried to publish this, and one of our reviewers said, well, nice job on the model, but you should be going out and collecting this and analyzing how much nitrogen, iron, or phosphorus is in the poop. Popular Science soon after called poop collector one of the worst jobs in science. I don't know. I guess I feel like even a bad day on the water is better than a good day in the office. But fair enough. If you, one thing warning about whale poop is if you get it on your clothes, it doesn't matter how many times you put it through the laundry. Basically, it's going to smell of whale for a long time. That having been said, I think of whale poop as being incredibly beautiful and diverse, where many of us are sitting here in Vermont, much the way that Wilson Snowflake Bentley thought of each snowflake as being unique and beautiful. I think of the same thing for whale feces. You can see it on the upper left there. That's blue whales. It's bright red. It's floating. On the right hand upper right, you can see this nice yellow plume. And even on the lower right there, that's from a humpback whale calf that a colleague of mine collected. And you can see the fecal plume of sperm whales there. So it's diverse and important, and something we really didn't think about until about 15 years ago. That having been said, it's really hard to find whale feces in the ocean. It's not like going out and collecting cow patties in a field. Whales are not that common, and it's hard to see from the surface. About 15 years ago, Roz Rolland, one of my colleagues, thought, well, if scat detecting dogs works on land, maybe it can work on the oceans. This is Fargo, a Rottweiler whose career started. He was a companion animal for a woman and a senior who eventually ended up in assisted living. And Fargo then got a job sniffing drugs in a local prison. This was out in the West Coast. And then he got what I think would be a dream job for many dogs, is he became a wildlife detecting dog, working mostly on grizzlies, mountain lions, looking for poop for these species. Roz Rolland, who's a vet, thought, well, if it works on land, maybe it'll work on the water. So they trained two dogs, Fargo here and Bob, to find whale feces. They were incredibly successful at it, much better than we humans were at finding at sea, but through detecting the scent that they were trained on. Unfortunately for Fargo, he was prone to seasickness, so he had to have Dramamine before he went on the water. And Bob was terrified of whales, so he would just cower at the bottom of the boat whenever a whale arrived. So Bob retired after one season, but he retired in Vermont. Friends of ours took him, and he had a happy retirement, as did Fargo eventually. This shows you how detecting at sea can work for a scat detecting dog. There's Fargo on the left. And just as if you've ever watched a dog on a scent trail, they're sallying up current. So they're hitting a scent and then they're going upwind looking for the actual, in this case, whale feces. The black box is where Fargo smells it at first on the right. When you see the X, that means he's off it. And eventually he finds it. This original scent detection was from a nautical mile away, and it enabled my colleagues to triple the rate of samples they could find in a day. That circle in the center there, the bottom center, is when humans can smell it. We can smell it at about 100 yards. So one way of optimizing finding these species. That's kind of the old school way of doing it, even though it's only 15 years ago, of trying to find whale feces. Nowadays, one way that we can really understand what whales do at the oceans, when I started working in the field in the 1990s, just about everything we knew about whales was what we could observe at the surface. And that's kind of like watching whales sleep. It's not really where they're doing their most interesting things. So now drone technology and suction cup tags that stick to the whale for about 10 to 24 hours have revolutionized what we understand is going on beneath the surface. So here's a drone. It's going to release the suction cup tag. This is a Gulf of California, and it's a fin whale. So the drone's up above, and then it drops the tag, and it sticks. You see the whale doesn't even react. It's just like a little sticker on the back. And then at that point, we can follow the whale's movements for many hours at a time. I'm lucky enough, when I first started giving this talk about a year ago, I have some underwater footage that was embargoed, but a colleague of mine has allowed me to share that. So I'm going to show you what it looks like beneath the surface as well. So these are mackerel scad here. On the lower right is a humpback calf, newborn calf, maybe a month old, and the upper left is the mom. And we're going to watch life in Hawaii, is where it is, from a humpback calf's point of view. You might be able to hear some music. A friend of mine set some music to this. It works either way. So right now the calf's right under mom. The fish are interested probably in the skin that's coming off the whales. And then mom pees. And this is important for the work I do. I've never seen a female whale pee before, so I'm thrilled to see this. The nutrients, of course, especially nitrogen and phosphorus, are in the pee. And now calf is starting to move, and it's starting to nurse on the female. So you see it's cloudy. That's milk coming out of the mom. And there you can see the pectoral fin of the mom right there. And again, you're looking at, this is from the view of the calf beneath the mom, the surface at the top. Again, you can see a little bit of the milk there. Adult whales can stay underwater for maybe 10 to 20 minutes, but the calves can't. So now calf is just eaten, and you can see it needs a breath of air, so it's coming to the surface. And then there you go. So it's coming up, taking a breath, and it's going to, I think, get one more breath, and then we'll move up. With this breath, you can actually see the researchers briefly at the surface, and that's Maui in the background. And that's mom. So for me, that honestly, having worked in this field, that has blown my mind and given me all kinds of thoughts about where we can go forward. The projects that I'm working on today is this movement of nutrients by whales across vast distances. We call it the great whale conveyor belt. That you just saw the mom on the winter grounds, the breeding grounds. That image on the right is a tiger shark that's been feeding on a calf carcass. Just like other mammals, calf mortality is high, juvenile mortality is higher than it is for the adults. So they're moving nutrients through placentas, carcasses, urine, and in other ways also through skin sloughing. And that's what we're trying to quantify now is, if you think about if you've ever gone to the Caribbean or Hawaii, how clean those waters are, that's in part because they really have very few nutrients. The whales are bringing in a small amount of nutrients into this area, and potentially large to the areas like Hawaii or the Caribbean. When whales die at sea, they can also drop into the deep sea. This is a gray whale carcass here, and you can see it's surrounded by sea cucumbers as well as worms. My book, and we've been chatting, it looks at eating and pooping and dying. The worms that we see here only do one of those. All animals have to die, but they don't eat and they don't poop. Basically, they're getting the nutrients from the bones, and in that root system that you could see at the center, they're feeding the nitrogen and carbon to symbiotic bacteria inside their bodies, and the bacteria creating the nutrients that the worms need. So 100 species found only in these deep sea systems, nowhere else on the planet. Back in 2019, I was working on this research in Iceland and got up early one morning. And as I was putting together my capstone, the final lecture of my time there on a Fulbright, I realized that all the research I did could come down to just 3 words: eat, poop, die. And at that point, I said it'd be the title of my next book. And now, finally, 5 years later, here we are, and the book is out. It started with whales, but as we've chatted, it includes lots of species, including some that are here in Vermont that I'll mention in a moment. Here's one. Wood frog. So we've all just been through spring. You're probably familiar with the sound of wood frogs. They winter underground, and they're something similar to hibernating. They don't pee during the winter. They reuse that nitrogen in order to protect the heart, protect the bloodstream. But then when they get to the vernal springs, they release nitrogen, and a large amount of nitrogen comes from those forests out into the vernal ponds. Of course, that's where the tadpoles are going to feed, other tadpoles are going to feed. So even here in Vermont, these processes are happening all the time, whether it's following something like wood frogs, or, as we're all familiar with, beavers, probably the most visible animals when you think about this process of how animals can be ecosystem engineers. We've all seen the dams, the lodges. They are, of course, changing the landscape, but they're also changing the way nutrients move through that system. If you think about it, a new dam can act as a barrier for nutrients like phosphorus to stay up out of lakes and within that system, and can be recycled in those systems. Old beaver dams, as they start to fall apart, then they can start leaching that phosphorus. So it's very dynamic. And that's really what beavers are doing. They're creating heterogeneity in these river systems. We've all been through these floods. We know how important these buffering, filtering systems can be here in Vermont and elsewhere. There were once millions of beavers throughout North America, and much of the continent had beaver dams throughout that system. Straight running rivers at that point were a rarity. Some of you may experience black flies, midges, mosquitoes emerging in different areas. Right now, when I was in Iceland, I also found that there was one lake called Mývatn, where it was basically Midge Lake, where tons of midges that emerge to mate, and then when they die, they leave the nutrients on the side along the edges of the lake. The local farmers, sheep farmers there, call it meagrass or midge grass. There's so much food coming out of the lake onto these areas. It's equivalent to about 2 million meatballs every year, anytime this emergence comes, just from a relatively small lake going out into these ecosystems. So when you see a midge while you're moving about, we don't have luckily, this kind of mass migration where it looks like a wool blanket over the landscape, but they're also doing their job. We've all probably been reading about cicadas lately. We don't have the massive emergence and the trillions here that occurred a few years ago along the East Coast and is emerging now in the South and Midwest. These cicadas, if you think about it, are acting similar almost to like the whales. They feed for 16, 17 years on sap beneath the forest surface, and then they emerge one time at the end of their lives to breed, and then after they breed, they die, and they're bringing all those nutrients to the forest surface, also feeding lots of birds and lots of animals who are changing their behavior, when all of a sudden there's this vast banquet of food surrounding them. I didn't get to travel to Africa for this book, but I did go via FaceTime with a friend of mine who's been looking at the movement of nutrients by hippos in the Masai Mara in Kenya. Hippos largely are grass feeders. They feed at night, and during the day, they go into river systems to rest and also to poop. And they bring lots of nutrients in that system. Hippo ponds can look very different because of all the nitrogen going into that area than other systems. So they're also, like the beavers, creating heterogeneity in the area. But we need a reality check here. Unfortunately, as lovely as these stories are, our world, of course, has changed a lot since humans arrived. And right now, we've been talking about mammals, whether we're talking about hippos or we're talking about whales. 36% of the biomass of all mammals on the planet is us, is humans, and 60% of it are our livestock, like cows, like sheep. So much of we really are the dominant force right now. Only 4% of the wild mammals, of the mammals on the planet are wild. That includes blue whales or rhinos or white-tailed deer or fin whales. In fact, interesting point, of that 4%, the most abundant wild mammal on the planet is actually the white-tailed deer. So they have more biomass than even all the whales do. And this is true. What's true for mammals is also true for birds. Most of the birds on the planet are also chickens, turkeys, and other poultry. So, as for those of us who are interested in wild processes, we have our work cut out for us as trying to think about how we can rebalance that. It's no wonder that we didn't think of mammals, that animals were kind of overlooked in their role in ecosystems because wild animals are so rare. How can we turn this around? For me, fortunately, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, I've seen some changes only in recent years. The protection of northern elephant seals, for example. So there were only about 20 individuals on the planet in the 1920s in the Pacific coast. This photo here shows that there were more northern elephant seals here in this photo than there were on the planet in the 1920s. And now there are there's almost 200,000 elephant seals. They have completely recovered because we stopped hunting them, we protected their habitat. We can restore animals. And those of you who are in Vermont, who have been long timers here, can think of other species that have been returned here. For example, white-tailed deer were very rare only 100 years ago, 50 years ago. Wild turkeys were restored to the system. Beavers were restored. Bald eagles. So it's not just marine mammals. That's what I study, but it's lots of species that we can restore through good stewardship. I grew up in New York. I never saw a whale as a kid. Humpbacks are now back in this area. Right whales are back in this area. Fin whales are back. This is a humpback whale in front of the Empire State Building. 2/3 of U.S. marine mammals with known trends are increasing. That's thanks to legislation like the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Protection Act. These are just classic laws passed in the 1970s. Also, protection of fisheries. Now fish populations are back up in this area. Great whales and other species are returning to these areas. It just requires good stewardship, in this case of the oceans, but also of the lands, of course. I'll wrap up quickly with one other species that I've been studying. I was fortunate enough to be in Alaska recently, and this is the sea otter, another species that was almost completely wiped off the planet only about 100 years ago because its fur was so valuable. I've been talking a lot about pooping and dying, but these are eating machines. They eat about 25% of their body weight per day. And they were down to just a very small population in the Aleutians, that red circle there. And unfortunately, the main island where they were found in the 1970s was going to be the site of the largest underground atomic explosion in the early 1970s. Fortunately, biologists said, we have an answer for you if you don't want to see these sea otters hit by this bomb. They offered to transport hundreds, up to 500 sea otters in that area. The Atomic Energy Commission paid for it, and it has worked amazingly well. There are now 50,000 descendants of those airlifted sea otters from that one area, not only are there more sea otters, but they've also changed the ocean systems in the area. This is what it looks like off the coast of British Columbia or the Pacific coast in the absence of sea otters. Just a lot of sea urchins, which are herbivores, very little algae like kelp. After the sea otters were returned, kelp comes back, fish come back to that area, the entire system changes. Like Surtsey and I think the whales, sea otters also give us a good example of what can happen when we restore wild species. Nowadays, we're starting to think about whether animals can be climate solutions as well. This is complicated. In some cases, yes, I think they can play a very important role. In other places, it might be much smaller, but everything from bison to whales to hippos to elephants all play a role in this system. And what I dream of is, just as in the 1970s, the Atomic Energy Commission funded the restoration of some animals, maybe we could think of the climate crisis as a way to help us encourage people to restore species, new wild species throughout the world. So in conclusion, I think let's replace our carbon footprints with the tracks of wild animals. And with that, happy to take questions. Thank you all for your time, especially on a beautiful day today. If I can get out, there we go, stop share.
All right. That was amazing. I
Oh,
actually,
thank you.
I have so many nuggets. If people don't have questions, I certainly do, or at least points that I was like, wow, that was really cool, and how that relates. So, yeah, the first thing I wanted, hang on, let me add this. There we go, so they can see me talking too. Um, is First of all, I love the idea of the gift of the island of Surtsey, right? I actually hadn't heard of Surtsey, so that was new information for me. And I recently visited New Zealand, and it's an island system, but it's so degraded by what we've introduced there, both mammals and plants. And so to have an island system that's now kind of starting over is really exciting. So thank you for sharing that. That's my first nugget.
Yeah.
Um, that was cool.
I'll jump in 1 second since you mentioned New Zealand. They have protected some islands where they've removed all invasive species, and there you see something like Surtsey where the birds come back and the whole system changes. So even in a place like New Zealand, they can reverse that.
Yeah, it's cool down there. They've got, we have 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 here in Vermont. They have predator free by 2050. And wherever you hike, you're finding different box traps and other traps to eliminate the mammal population. So it's fascinating. The other thing I loved hearing about was packing all the food in the seeds, that those initial ones just had everything they needed in the seed, which, think about it, but it was just really nice to point it out in that colonizing way. So thank you for that. And the other thing I wanted to share that really kind of sparked to me, so a lot of cooperators who go through the training, we talk about the history of wildlife in Vermont. We talk about passenger pigeons and the volume of passenger pigeons and the amount of poop that affected the forests during that time, the volume of birds breaking branches, the amount of poop affecting the nitrogen in the soil. So there's another one that I'm sure you've thought of, but boy, I think it might relate to a lot of our Vermonters as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. Aldo Leopold wrote that when they passed through, it was like something like an ecological storm when the passenger pigeons passed through. And just as you say, one can only imagine what the forests were like when they were the most abundant bird on the planet. When you had them passing through these systems, it must have been incredibly different. And it really is amazing.
Well, when you talk about lifting baselines, I really like that because it's also hopeful. I've heard of shifting baseline syndrome, right? Where we think we know what we know is here because that's what we've seen, but we really haven't shifted back to what was before. So I like the hopefulness of your lifting baselines.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's intentional. A couple of colleagues and I put that together in about 5 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, for exactly that reason, because we felt that people weren't realizing that some species are actually gone. I'm sure there are a lot of young Vermonters that don't realize that at one point, like white-tailed deer were virtually absent from here. or something like wild turkeys. And so we get used to it, right? You get whatever your starting point in these areas is what you think is natural. Another great example of that is gray seals in Cape Cod. They were completely gone 100 years ago, and now there are about 40,000 have been restored to that area. People think, well, they're brand new, but actually they had been around a long time ago, and now we're restoring those systems. So yeah, I'm glad you appreciate that. We've really been trying to push that idea to people, encourage people that we can turn these things around, these trends around.
Yeah, that's very hopeful. Thank you. There is a question in the chat box. Cynthia wants to know, how does global warming impact the impact of wild animals on land and in the ocean?
Yeah, that's a good one. I'll start with the oceans because that's where I work. And this again, I'll try and like think about my lifetime. 1970s when I started working on 1990s rather, when I started working on right whales. They were found extensively in the Bay of Fundy, and they came there every year. And then about 5 years ago, they stopped coming. And they started going up to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And that's probably because their food disappeared. That's in a very short time. And that put these whales at risk because there was an area where there was a lot of fishing gear and shipping that they had never been seen before. So there's one case in a short term that we see the shift, because I had done a paper about the nutrient movement by right whales in the Bay of Fundy, and now that is gone. So these nutrient processes can be quite fragile. That would be true on land too. I mean, think about the decline in migratory species, whether it's bird species. Think of the red knot, for example, that feeds on horseshoe crabs that's traveling from North America to South America, or the bison that historically traveled throughout North America. So it's a mixed bag. They're going to be affected by climate, but the restoration of many of these species can also help us do two things. One, reduce some of the carbon that's going back into the atmosphere. More importantly, increase the resilience of the habitats where they're found. A habitat without animals is a depauperate place. So restoring animals means that you're going to have a more diverse forest as well as a more resilient one. So yes, climate's going to affect it, but restoring animals can help us protect us or mitigate some of those impacts.
That's great. I think about Doug Tallamy's call to, plant an oak tree, right? And, we need to bring those insects back. And like that was even shown by your CERTSI study, right? The nitrogen, then you had the plants come in, and then we had the insect population. And so we need to bring that back. So I think it's a general call from biologists around the world to, let's rewild.
Agreed. And that's a good thank you for reminding me not to just talk about whales and bison, but also about midges and cicadas and all of the other species, which matter equally. And I care as much about it, even if I talk often about the larger animals.
I don't know. I have to tell you, that whale video was amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for sharing. That was pretty incredible to have that. It blew
my mind the first time I saw it. Thank you. Yeah.
I can imagine. Let's see. Kathy notes, your talk gave us a unique view and much to think about, and she also appreciates your fantastic video footage.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, Kathy.
The other two things that I was fascinated about was just the way you talked about the movement of the animals as the circulatory system. That is such a great vision to think about. We've always talked about migration and movement, and I've seen the migration and movement maps, but to talk about it as like a circulatory system was really fascinating to me.
Thank you. And of course, we often think of plants as the lungs of the planet, but we tend to forget that animals are also playing that role. So I'm glad that resonated. This is Chris Dowdy, who's one of the characters in the book. He's the one that thought of that. And I was like, oh, I want that. That's fabulous. Right. So, he studies Pleistocene animals. So animals in North America and South America 15,000 years ago. One can only imagine what the world was like when bison were among the smallest of the large mammals. You had giant sloths and giant armadillos and mastodons and mammoths. Think about how the circulatory system was like that.
That's great. Well, we're rounding on 1 o'clock, so I want to respect your time and everybody's time who's joined us for lunch. This was fascinating, has given me so much to think about. And so all of those who are also thinking, hold up your book there, Joe, should get a
Oh,
copy
thank
of
you. Yes,
Eat,
please.
Poop, and Die. You can get
In
it
your
at
local
a
bookstore.
or library, whatever. But yeah, check it out. I think it sounds like a great book with some great philosophies. Thank you for your time. Thank you to Laura for arranging for all this. It's been a great talk, and yeah, a lot to think
Thank you,
about.
Lisa. Great. Thanks everyone for joining. Enjoy the day.